Hello everyone, and many thanks for joining us today for the first webinar in the WDI's Webinar 2021 series on diversity and inclusion reporting. My name is Anya Clark and I'm the Investor Engagement Manager for the WDI. This webinar is all about taking stock and moving forward, and we will dig deeper into the theme of diversity and inclusion and outline the importance of corporate transparency as a key step to improving diversity and inclusion in practice. We will explore the actions of companies and investors are taking to improve gender and racial equity within and through their operations and investments. We will also be reflecting on the events of 2020, where we will discuss the importance of diversity and inclusion to investors and their own local contexts. We will also be very excitedly unveiling the WDI diversity and inclusion findings and also unveiling our diversity and inclusion investor briefing. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, but if you have any technical or sound issues, we will endeavour to remedy them as soon as possible, so do write them in the chat. And also this webinar will be recorded and be available on the WDI's YouTube for you to view and download. And just a little bit about the WDI before we get started. The WDI is a coalition of over 50 investor signatories with just under $7 trillion in assets under management. So the aim of the WDI is to improve corporate transparency and accountability on workforce issues and to enable robust investor stewardship and sustained and meaningful investor company engagement on these issues. The WDI's convening power fosters a peer-to-peer learning and raises workforce and corporate supply chain due diligence and reporting standards across the board. And that is the thinking behind the WDI's webinar series. So without further ado, let me welcome our panelists. So we have Charlotte Lush, the WDI's Research Manager Extraordinaire, Daniela Jaramillo, a Senior Responsible Investment Advisor at HESTA, Ajit Dayal, founder at Quantum Advisors, and Solange Jeune, who is a Senior ESG Analyst at Candriam. So Daniela is a Senior Responsible Investment Advisor at HESTA, where she focuses on integrating the Sustainable Development Goals into the fund's investment strategy. Daniela has held roles in responsible investment across the UK and US before settling in Australia. She's the chair of the Investor Working Group of 4040 Vision, a member of the Board of Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, and a member of PRI Stewardship Advisory Committee. Ajit Dayal has over 30 years of experience in the investment sector. In 1990, he founded Quantum Advisors India, a multi-asset India-focused investment firm. He served as Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Hansberger Global Investors, and on their behalf was lead manager for the Vanguard International Value Fund from 1999 to 2004. Ajit is a member of the board of Pacific Pension Institute and the Global Leadership Council at UNC. Additionally, in 2001, Ajit set up Help Your NGO to help NGOs in India. Solange joined Candriam in 2017 as a senior ESG analyst. Previously at Schroders in the ESG team, she worked on ESG integration into equity, debt, and real estate portfolios and conducted climate change research for the Global Climate Change Fund. She also worked at Jupiter Asset Management as a sustainability analyst, focusing on the dark green investment fund range. She is the author of Candriam's most recent insights report on ethnic diversity and why investors can't stay silent. Many thanks for being with us today. So before we jump into the discussion, I'm going to hand it over to the WDI's Research Manager, Charlotte Lush, to explain the state of play of diversity and inclusion reporting, drawing on insights from the 2020 survey findings. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Anya. Hi, everyone. So before we get stuck in, I thought it may be helpful to have an overview of what we mean by diversity and inclusion. I think that diversity and inclusion are sometimes treated synonymously, but they are distinct, although very closely related concepts. So diversity refers to the level of representation of any dimension that reflects people's different identities and backgrounds. This can include things like their ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, social background, religion and belief, among many, many other different factors. Inclusion refers to the extent to which people are valued for their distinctive ideas, experiences and perspectives, and are provided with equal opportunities for participation. In the context of businesses, I think quite a snappy way of thinking about this is that essentially diversity refers to a company's ability to get different groups through the door, and inclusion is the extent to which organizations create an environment that makes them want to stay. So I will now get stuck into some of the headline findings from the 2020 cycle of the WDI. So one of the first things we found this year is that companies can provide significantly more data on their plans and strategies relating to diversity and inclusion than they could on the workers these plans would actually impact. So 2020 data showed that there was a real mismatch between plans, data on plans and data on the workforce itself. 138 companies could explain their plans to address diversity and inclusion, but only 5 companies could give information for every gender indicator in the WDI. While the majority of companies, in this case 78%, stated how the company had addressed or intended to address pay gaps and pay ratios, only 57% of companies could actually provide data on their gender pay gap, and just 4% provided data on the ethnicity pay gap. So a really stark difference there. I also think it's important to flag that this the 4% figure for companies that could provide data on their ethnicity pay gap is 4% of the companies that did not operate in context where they were prohibited from collecting ethnicity data. So we've excluded companies that have kind of legal limits on their ability to collect this data. So I think it really shows that even when you're accounting for legal restrictions, corporate data collection on ethnicity is really in its infancy compared to gender. We also saw this similar sort of pattern when we were looking at discrimination and harassment. So 96% of companies could give data about their discrimination and harassment policy, but this number more than halved when it came to the number of companies that could give data on discrimination and harassment incidents reported, which only 41% of companies could provide information on. And it dropped even further when we asked for data on the number of instances that were resolved. This went down to 35%. And I think that while it's really great that companies do have comprehensive information on plans, if they don't have comprehensive information on the actual constitution of their workforce, their ability to put those plans into practice is more limited. For plans and initiatives to work, a company really does need to understand the composition of its workforce. Without this data, companies can't see if they're attracting and retaining a diverse pool of talent, and they're unable to design initiatives that will respond to the needs of their workforce. It also means that organizations are often taking a shot in the dark, implementing policies without knowing who is in their workforce and what it is that they need. So a second key finding from this year's cycle was that how advanced diversity data collection is by no means universal for different diversity strands. And companies can provide significantly more data on gender than they can for ethnicity. So this is something that we saw across a number of areas of the survey. More than twice as many companies could provide data on the gender breakdown of their workforce, which was 75% of companies, than could provide data on the workforce's ethnic composition, which was only 36% of companies. This reflects what we saw with pay gaps, where more than 10 times as many companies could provide data for the gender pay gap than the ethnicity pay gap, even when we adjusted for kind of legal restrictions on collecting that data. I think now kind of moving on to thinking about what these findings actually mean for companies. I think it can be really easy to bundle a range of different groups under the banner of diversity and inclusion and then miss the fact that data collection and progress is uneven. But different groups do have different needs and different experiences. And if organizations don't specifically take steps to collect information on ethnicity or on any other kind of diversity characteristic, and instead take either a patchy or attempt to sort of one size fits all approach, it's ultimately going to result in certain groups being left behind. And I think this is something that we see with the results from this year's WDI. I think that the events of 2020 have served to focus corporate attention on racial oppression and the importance of meaningfully considering how race and ethnicity relate to their operations. So hopefully next year we will see organisations back up these commitments that they've made with the data that they need to make a change, and there'll be a significant reduction in the gap in these figures. So the last finding that we will look at today is that companies appear to be prioritising data collection on diversity and leadership over diversity data for other groups of workers. So companies responding to the WDI could provide significantly more data on diversity and leadership compared to more precarious or vulnerable workers. Companies reported data on women in leadership positions more than any other gender metric, including the gender breakdown of the total workforce. So an average of 86% of companies could provide the percentage of women in leadership positions, which in the WDI refers to the board, executive committee and senior leadership, which is 11% more companies than could give their overall workforce gender breakdown. This focus on leadership data contrasts quite significantly with levels on data on levels of data on the most precarious or vulnerable female workers. So only 36% of companies could explain how many female workers have a basic salary that is equal to or just above the legal minimum wage, and just 9% could give the gender breakdown of their contingent workforce. So while obviously data collection on diversity and leadership is a really essential component of broader diversity and inclusion initiatives and efforts to increase progression and representation, this does make up a tiny proportion of the overall workforce. The lowest paid workers and contingent workers are often a much larger proportion of the workforce than those in leadership positions. And these are also the workers who feel the negative consequences of a failure on diversity and inclusion the most keenly. And they tend to have the most limited recourse to address this as well. So because of this, it really is essential that companies prioritise diversity data collection for these workers and then use this data to ensure that their diversity and inclusion efforts include and consider all workers, not just those at the very top. So just very quickly onto the WDI diversity and inclusion briefing. So to support companies and investors when looking to understand and address diversity and inclusion, we have developed briefings that provide a deeper dive into some of the topics that we've discussed so far. So the briefings offer a more comprehensive look into the findings of the WDI relating to diversity and inclusion, and also provide practical information for companies and investors on how to improve transparency in this area. So we will pop a link to the briefings in the chat. And if you have any questions about the briefings or the WDI's findings relating to D&I, yeah, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and I will pass back to Anya now.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was really insightful. Fab, so I'll just get the panel involved now and I guess get your reflections or thoughts on the findings of the analysis. And also reflecting on your own local context. Can you kind of explain your experience with D&I reporting and practice from your own experience?
The government has mandated and they've put in place the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And it's really interesting because it is trying to capture, and it's mandated to capture that any company, not only listed companies, that exceed a specific threshold of revenue have to report on data, but it's mainly related to gender. It does include things like the type of contracts, so if they're full-time or if they are permanent or contracts. And it also includes data such as the compensation, just to be able to analyze the gender pay gap. So that in a way, it has helped investors, and it has helped put more visibility to the cause. However, it hasn't really helped increase diversity, especially at those top levels. I think that we've had enough disclosure, and this is something that perhaps we've seen in general in the ESG industry, where disclosure doesn't necessarily mean a change in the outcomes. And I think that's something that we as investors are really trying to move the needle, is really thinking we want more disclosure, but disclosure for what? And so we want disclosure so that we can engage with companies, so we can understand where the main problems are, or understand what is working and what doesn't working, what is not working, but not just disclosure for the sake of disclosure. So back to your question, I think the Workplace for Gender Equality Agency and the data that they mandate for employees, for companies to collect and report annually, has been very important to put the issue in the agenda, but not necessarily to really drive more diversity, especially in those top areas where the majority of the companies are lacking in the leadership positions at executive level and CEO -1, -2, and -3.
Thank you, Daniela. And then Ajit, the context is very different in India. Maybe you could shed some light on that for us.
Sure, would love to. Firstly, I really want to thank the WDI and you, Anya, and Charlotte, and your colleagues for onboarding us. We're absolutely honored to be the first company, I think, in India that has signed down to the WDI pledge, if you will, and we hope to make it more popular within India. But to give you some kind of context, right? As an investment management firm, as someone kind of watching India, while in some sense India is very diverse, so we've just had this big celebration in the US for having their first vice president who's a woman, and of course much of Europe, Israel, even India, we've had leaders in our country who've been women. So in India you've got prime ministers, presidents, chief ministers who've been women, and yet at the other spectrum you have a lot of disadvantages towards women because society in general expects women to kind of get the degree so that they're more marriageable and that's it. So of course, much of that is changing over the last 3 decades, and we've seen that massive evolution. And the question is, how do you, from a company perspective, how do you carve out a niche and an opportunity for women to find their role in society within a company, given the societal role that they're playing and given the expectations of society, which of course are changing and getting better, each and every year. So in the Indian context, I think, the real thing is just your caste. So one is the male, female, which is the gender issue. And then the other is the caste and the background. Now, I know that many of my colleagues at work, just by someone's name, they can kind of tell you a whole history of that person, which town they're from, what ethnicity they are within the Indian context, etc. I was never trained to do that as some sense from a child in the family that I grew up. But, it's kind of strange. So, and on top of that, you've got the religious sort of divide that's been growing recently. And there's also been many companies in the past may have a bias against or towards one religion. So there are all these complexities of society, and it's yet to be reported. So we do have a census, we do have companies that ask information in the application form. At Quantum, I know for a fact, we've never ever asked or denied anyone a job based upon ethnicity, religion, etc., etc. We've never done that. So it's great that we're learning from WDI. What are the questions that we need to ask ourselves as an investment manager? We just gone through our first form filling exercise, and then we extend this to our portfolio companies and make sure that after we've cleansed our own house, or in the process of cleansing our own house, how do we turn the mirror and the spotlight on the investing companies in which we operate? But I think it's an extremely important issue because, we read again about this dichotomy. At one level, women are worshipped in India, and at the other level, they're rejected. And so you've got this massive dichotomy, and it's also within corporate India, less so, but it's there within corporate India. So it needs to be cleansed out a lot for sure.
Ajit, I think that really ties in with what Solange was saying, and Daniela at the start about the context of diversity and inclusion reporting, and taking that into consideration when you are reviewing, both your own operations and also investee companies' operations. And I just want to ask now about, COVID and the events of 2020. And in your own opinion, I know it's a big question, but how that has affected, D&I and practice and also reporting. And maybe if we could start with Daniela on this one, given your own experience.
Sorry, Aim. So are you saying you want some background on? You got cut out.
Sorry, it was how COVID has affected the landscape for D&I reporting and indeed diversity and inclusion policy and practice from your own experience.
Yeah, COVID. That's what I missed. So I think in Australia, the companies that are used to reporting haven't necessarily changed their approach in terms of improving or reducing their policies and their level of reporting. At the same time, as I said, some of it is mandated by the government. So if they're collecting it for the WGEA, the Workplace for Gender Equality Agency, they might as well just publish it in the report. So I don't think it has changed in that perspective, but it has raised a few conversations about how are different groups impacted, and particularly women have been impacted as a result of, for example, working from home. And where most of the burden of families with children, where most of that burden falls on. When, for example, here in Melbourne, we had a really long and very stringent lockdown where there was a lot of homeschooling and with people with young children that were not at school had to stay at home. And so how has that impacted women and specific, so households and women and working women? And so I think it has raised the point of that inclusion perspective and ensuring that companies have the adequate policies and practices for flexibility so that they don't lose that talent during this the lockdowns that we've suffered here in Australia. So I think that's one of the key issues that has been raised. The other issue that has been discussed broadly here is how are certain policies existing at the moment about specifically how subsidies regarding childcare are preventing women from joining the workforce. And we've seen many companies come out publicly and advocate for changes at the policy level. So I think it definitely has raised the issue of not necessarily just gender diversity, but in general gender equality, and to the public debate, including policy makers and companies. But it has also raised some point about flexible working arrangements. And I think that in the long run, the benefits of this is that companies might have not been aware of how they might have been at risk of losing talent because they didn't have the right practices. And hopefully this will allow for some companies to keep those adequate working arrangements, such as working from home or flexible schedules, which will allow for better participation of women at all levels of the organization.
If I may just sort of pick up on where Daniela left off, I think in India too, the context is somewhat similar, right? Where you have the woman looking after the child. We had a pretty severe lockdown in India. So you have the woman looking after the child with the complication that in many cases, when women are married, they're living with the in-laws. So there's a father-in-law, there's a mother-in-law, there's a brother-in-law, there's a sister-in-law, there's a husband and the kids. And it generally you tend to look at the daughter-in-law of the house to fulfill the responsibilities of that entire family. So you can imagine the burden on the woman more than just in the Western space where you kind of tend to live alone and you've got your own kids and your nuclear family. And here you've got that added responsibility. So, and I think that's, obviously must be very stressful for a lot of women who must be waiting for the offices to reopen so they can get back to office and flee the pressures that may be at home. So there's that balance again, like, okay, how much time, but also I think the plus point is the fact that they do not have to commute, and particularly places like Bombay or Delhi or Bangalore, where in those cities the urban commute is pretty miserable. So they save that time and the tension. That is the positive of working from home. But then the negative is you have to deal with all the other issues that come with being a daughter-in-law in a sort of a joint family, as we call it in the Indian context. So a lot of challenges over there.
Thanks, Ajit. Solange, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you very much, Daniela and Ajit. I love the perspective of India and Australia, and it's good to see, to compare if what we're going through here now with lockdown is similar or not. I think yes, definitely. We know that women have been statistically more impacted than COVID for all the reasons that you've given. And yeah, they've been in charge of, homeschooling and more than the fathers, generally speaking. We know that women are often in the low-paid jobs statistically, so they might have been more exposed to redundancy or losing their jobs in a crisis situation. They also, interestingly, they're also more into the healthcare sectors in Europe, so often they've been simply more exposed to the virus. So that's another kind of inequality in facing the virus. So lots of there've been a lot said about women impacted in the crisis. I think because I've focused so much on ethnic diversity, it's worth mentioning as well that COVID has had a very unequal impact on some of the ethnic minorities and on especially some of the Black and Asian populations. And so and we don't know exactly why this is, but there's a range of factors and probably a combination of factors which are related, social economic factors probably, talking about living conditions, access to healthcare and so on. And I think I would like to raise this because the reason why we know that is not thanks to some of the European policies. We don't have the data about ethnicity, ethnic diversity and ethnicity in some of the European societies. This is data we've got from the UK or Brazil or the US, who have monitored what have been the impact of COVID on some of the African descent or the ethnic minorities. And I think that's very important because it shows the interconnection between health and the worst that we can expect in a crisis like COVID, and the social and economic inequalities that some of the ethnic minorities go through. So I think that's important, and because it's also raised some concern about European countries which cannot analyze this data, that we have not been able to do this analysis of who is impacted by COVID, what does it mean for different groups of people in my society, and now they are revisiting what they should do about this data, which as of today we're not allowed to collect and analyze. In terms of our investee companies, this is a debate we've asked to have. So there's a number of funds for which we engage companies, typically specifically on human capital management, and we've asked a question about COVID. What does this mean for you in 2020? What does this mean for your workforce? And I have to say we have so far very little answer. And I think again it might be because there's still not enough work, or it's too much resource to allocate to the analysis of this data. Maybe companies, where they can tell us, have some issues around their reputation, talking about the impact of COVID on their workforce. I don't know, but I think it's maybe a bit early to get to get this information. But this is a discussion we want to have with our companies, and we will keep asking what this means for their workforce. And there's lots of positives, and I'm glad, Daniela and Ajit highlighted it, such as, rethinking flexible working, but there are also other things we need to think about, the risks of some of the very exposed population and workforce, and how do we deal with this and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Solange. The WDI also introduced some metrics on questions rather on COVID-19 this year. So we're hoping to get some some good analysis, but from a high level perspective, I think companies have still not quite solidified the policies and practices around dealing with the virus that we would expect to see kind of in a more as the pandemic goes on. So yeah, we will definitely release that data that we find in the findings report that will be released in March, the end of March. My next question is around inclusion, because obviously diversity is one thing, but inclusion is another. And I know we have spoken about the challenges of even collecting this kind of diversity data, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we can make workplaces truly inclusive, and some of the measures that some companies have taken, for example, introducing quotas, tying remuneration to non-financial KPIs on diversity and inclusion, and whether you think that's an effective means of creating inclusion through these kind of mandated diversity metrics. And maybe, Daniela, we can start with you.
Yeah, and this ties in. I was reading one of the questions of the Q&A that I think the question relates to, what if you have perfect metrics, but what do you know what's really happening behind closed doors, and that there is that inclusive culture. And I think that culture is one of those things that we all talk about, but it's really hard to pinpoint how to know if there's a good culture or not. But I think that there's a few proxies that we look at whenever, and they're not necessarily a very clear indication, because I think culture and inclusion look different in different companies, and so it's even very difficult to pinpoint what that means for each company. But I think that we would normally look at specific pointers that act as proxies. So the first one is, I think that if you have diverse workforce at all levels of your organization, that is a pretty good proxy for inclusion, because they would not have gotten there if you didn't. It's pretty hard to achieve, for example, gender balance at all levels if you don't have an inclusive culture. And that, combined with, for example, employee turnover, can give you an idea that it's not an artificial thing that all of a sudden you've just hired and poached 3 executives for your C-suite just to ensure that you have that that gender balance at executive level, for example. So I think those 2 metrics combined can give you an indication of inclusion. It's not perfect, and the other thing is, as we know, we're talking only gender, and there's many other characteristics, as you flagged in your definition of inclusion, that go much more beyond gender. But again, I do think that companies that tend to be inclusive for women, they tend to be inclusive for women of different ethnic diversities, and women of different religions, and women of different level of abilities. And so it's a slightly controversial answer, because I have spoken with people that disagree with this. I do believe that gender diversity can act as a proxy of broader diversity, especially when you cannot have or collect that level of data. I think in general, that this is the case. The other type of things that we would look at is, I guess as investors, we don't really want to get involved in the micromanagement of the company. We mainly need to understand if the company is how they're looking at risks, and if they're looking at risks that come as a result of gender inequality or discrimination. And if this is something that is not only monitored at the executive level, but if the board has visibility into these issues. So what do we mean with this? We still find some companies here that believe that culture and inclusion are the domain of the CEO. this is something we're really engaging and pushing companies and saying culture is something that should be led from the top, and that the board should have good governance. And so we're constantly asking questions. So how do you know that the culture is going in the right direction? How do you know that there is an inclusive culture in these organizations? And I think that there's a few, and one of the few reasons that we've seen this really come out as a key risk in Australia, you might have heard a few of the examples, but I think issues that are happening globally, like the Black Lives Matter movement and like Me Too, are really elevating the risks, these kind of macro risks, but are being reflected in employees getting, in employees leaving companies, or even leaking news to the press when they're unhappy about some sort of unfairness that they've perceived in the companies they work for. And we've seen here that, I don't know, that I won't go into detail, but like a bank in AMP here in Australia, where there was an important sexual harassment scandal, and that person that was responsible for this, for sexual harassing one of his subordinates, was promoted to CEO. And there was a very big pushback from employees, from the media, from investors, that was escalated to the point where that CEO and the chair were forced to leave. And so this is how we're talking to companies about diversity, about inclusion and culture. This is an issue that impacts, that is a risk at the board level and should be dealt at the board level. And so asking those questions to companies about how do you monitor and how do you ensure that there's the right governance to ensure that there's
Thank you, Daniela. Solange, I don't know whether you have anything to add on that, or Ajit. I want to kind of move quickly to another question before we stop for the Q&A, which is, can you identify, or have you identified companies that are doing it right? What does good look like around diversity and inclusion, as an investor? Yeah, and can you give us a bit of an example of I guess, leading on from what Daniela said around this topic?
So, many companies in India have had, women CEOs, right? From State Bank of India to ICICI Bank. So I don't think that that's an issue in some sectors. In some sectors it may be. But I'd like to just go back to the query of quotas. I think that's important. So I'm not a big believer in quotas per se. And I'll give an example of Quantum of our own company. So, I think the tone at the top very clearly from us on our board and the senior members of the company is obviously to hire and recruit and promote people on merit, and not to have any kind of gender pay difference between the equal like professionals who work in the company. But about 6-7 years ago, we had a very strange incident in our company where we had 12 equity research analysts were women, and they left the company. And they left the company within one reporting cycle, within one calendar year. And when they left the site, when they left, we didn't. I mean, they left for different reasons, but it created a flag in one of our clients in North America. They sent us an email saying, "Hey, 25%, more than 25% of your workforce has left the company in 1 year. Of the research team has left in 1 year. Now, we're a fund manager, so for us, research is the engine which results in the portfolio. So that's like a problem, and we're going to put you in the penalty box. For 1 year, we will not allocate more money to you as a portfolio manager in India because of that." And I actually had to fly to North America to explain to them, look, that the 3 people who left, they were happened to be women. 2 of them got married. They got married, and one left the country and went to Europe. For all I know, she's probably working with Solange right now. But anyway, so one went off to Europe, and one got married, and the husband got relocated to Delhi, North India. So she had to leave and go to North India. Now, this is the era when we were not working on Zoom and we didn't have bandwidth, right? If the concept of working remotely didn't exist. And then the third lady, she was asked to sit at home so she could get married. So it so happened that, you know, 3 of them. Now, what do we do? Do we penalize the people that they've not achieved an objective of having a certain gender allocation? But you have to also think of the laws or the approach within the society, as I said at the start. For every company, for every country, it may be different. So I'm not a big fan of goals and trying to link that in some sense. But I certainly believe that the tone at the top, as Daniela described, between the board and the top management, if you set the tone and it's heard right through, then I think it kind of gets self-correcting, as what happened in the case in Australia, where the CEO, who was not a nice person, was effectively denied that role for his past misbehavior. So I think that you kind of have to leave some fuzziness to some extent around that, in my view.
If I may, yes, I really agree with this. And I could not agree more with what Daniela said about one type of diversity can drive another type of diversity. So if you think about gender versus ethnic diversity, actually, I think it's very interesting. I think, and I actually really believe the work we've achieved to some extent in terms of gender diversity will fuel an acceleration in the ethnic diversity debate, despite its complexities and despite the constraints such as access to data that we have. But I really believe this, as Daniela said, there is probably this kind of empathy, or at least some groups who have been in the position of being the minority can being a force to promote the other type of minority groups. So I found this dynamic very interesting. I think on quotas and targets, there's one thing for sure: quotas I don't consider as the one solution. I think, however, they can be an option, and one reason why they can be an option, and probably more on a voluntary basis. And I think voluntary targets and quotas as being successful in Europe to some extent for having women at top or board senior roles. And one reason is the concept of contact. The problem with diversity is people who are different, and we all have our unconscious biases. People who are different and think different have the natural tendency to co-opt people who are like them. And when you force the situation not to be the cooptation of people that look like you and think like you, when you force of being in contact and working together with you one common goal with people who think very differently, but if you give one common goal and one fight together, that is a very efficient way of breaking down the unconscious biases and tendency to not be wanting to work with people who think differently. So contact and forcing the situation of getting people together, I think, can be very efficient. So that would be one reason why I would recommend companies to have some sort of voluntary targets or quotas, and that can be done on their own basis. So they can have their own targets, but it can be done with being part of initiatives and groups. And I'm pretty sure there are groups on ethnic diversity or all type of diversity or gender diversity in each country. That can be a good way to do peer-to-peer comparison in terms of setting the targets and working together on good initiatives and so on, but having their own target and goals and forcing this contact, basically it's kind of forcing the diversity to some extent, hoping they will create the inclusion somehow down the road. But that's not enough, obviously. So I really believe that it's the top management and the culture you set from the top is very important. So if you have policies such as diversity policies and zero discrimination, zero tolerance for harassment policies and such like this, they need to come from the top and they need to be acknowledged by management and signed off. But I also believe that the role of people on the ground who actually do the business on a daily basis is very important, and that the only way you can create this inclusion is by giving the people the opportunity to set up their own targets, set up their own policies, programs, whether it's training, whether it's leadership, having champions to take the subject of diversity as their project, developing the training, developing the programs to encourage, to invite different type of people on the table. That will give their sense of ownership, and that will be a very efficient way of transforming mentalities inside of business. And this needs to be at every level. Yes, I think it's a mix of setting the right targets, even if they are voluntary, having a message from the top, as well as a real involvement of people at all levels of the company.
Thanks, Solange. Not an easy thing to do, but definitely something to strive for within organizations. And we do have a question in the chat. Given the local differences and sensitive nature of the topic, especially in certain countries, how do we speak to investee companies about ethnic differences, especially when investees are based in Asia and those European countries where this is indeed sensitive? Does the conversation require more customized engagement strategies? And actually, that leads me on to another question in the last couple of minutes that will answer this. What is investors' role in this discussion? And yeah, how can we improve that engagement? Daniela, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll try to be really quick. I think investors' role is really setting the expectations of how we think the system should operate. And what I mean with this is we need to look beyond company by company. I think we need to look at the whole ecosystem and if we are actually leading to real world outcomes. And while I think policies and plans are great, if they're really not delivering real world outcomes, which is actually equality and really see those key metrics of representation, we really need to hold those companies accountable, because I think that's the only way in which we can actually achieve change, which will lead to better performance of those companies, but also better performance at the whole, as universal owners at the whole system level.
Right. And Solange, just in terms of the customized strategies, sorry, Ajit, and then we'll go to you. In terms of customized engagement strategies, is that what's needed in order to speak to companies in certain jurisdictions?
Well, I really think so. So this question is very relevant. In our discussion, when we are phrasing our engagement, we are really phrasing it that we acknowledge there are sensitivities, regulatory frameworks which are different, and we are asking the company what can they do in this context. The most important for us is that the company becomes ambitious, first of all, aware and acknowledge the challenge and the opportunity, and then try to find out the best way to address this challenge within the context of, the regulatory, social constraints that they have. So typically, we do have this women fund where we want to invest in companies which have the best gender equality, but we will also engage with them on ethnic diversity and other type of diversity. But the question will always be tailored as what we can do in their jurisdiction. There is also, as investors, there are other things we can do. I think I agree with Daniela. We need to set the bar, and we going forward after this more kind of discussion engagement. If it's no result, you can also go to the governance and use your proxy voting to set your expectation. Voting for against the chairman, director of the chair of the nomination committees and things like that. But again, you have to look at it jurisdiction by jurisdiction. What can you ask in Australia for large or mid company? But as large investors, there's quite a few companies in your portfolio, so you can have these customized approaches, but I think the message is the same and the goal is the same at the end.
If I could just take 60 seconds on this, it's like, to me, if you look at the asset owners, the sovereign funds, sovereign wealth funds, the pensions, they control over $100 trillion, over $100 trillion. And in my view, they should be the leaders, and they are. We're seeing that now. They should be the people who lead to ensure that groups like WDI, that data is released. Once you have data, you can analyze it. And then you can customize for every country, for every society, for every sector even, try to figure out what the right approaches. But if $100 trillion is behind this, as was mentioned just now by Solange in terms of proxy voting, etc., you can make change really quickly, really, really quickly. So I'm extremely optimistic that 2-3 years from now we look back on this webinar and say, hey, this was fantastic, because everything that we discussed here has happened really quickly. I'm very, very optimistic on where things will be 3 years from now.
That's great, and what a nice sentiment to end. Apologies, we are slightly over time, but I just want to thank the panelists again for their really thought-provoking discussion and insights. Thank you, Charlotte, and for sharing some of the insights from the WDI survey. And as we mentioned, corporate transparency is a first step in improving diversity and inclusion practice, and that is what the WDI aims to achieve. So the findings from the WDI report will be released on the 31st of March, yeah, we hope to see you all at the next webinar very, very soon. So just thank you all very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.